The most feared man in the city was 3 seconds from death, and the only person who saw it coming was the woman everyone called Harmless. The ballroom of the Aurelian glittered like a swallowed chandelier. 400 of the wealthiest and most dangerous people in Calder, lifting flutes of champagne beneath a ceiling, painted with falling angels. The air thick with orchids and old money, and the particular silence that gathers around men who own things they should not. At the center of it all stood Lucian Varga, the Iron King, a god carved from shadow and marble in a midnight Brioni suit, untouchable, unbothered, accepting the careful smiles of men who would have cut his throat if they thought they could survive the attempt. Nobody was watching the waiter, nobody except Mara Quinn, who stood near the service doors with a tablet of seating charts pressed to her chest like a small soft shield. Round and quiet and invisible in a borrowed black dress, a size too tight at the waist. The assistant they let into the room only because someone had to know where the canapes went and which senator hated which billionaire. She had spent the whole evening doing the thing she always did, making herself smaller, folding her shoulders inward, apologizing with her body for the crime of taking up space, breathing in shallow, polite sips so that even her lungs would not inconvenience anyone, until a man in a server's white jacket crossed the marble with a tray, held a fraction too high, his stride a fraction too smooth, his left hand never quite leaving his hip. Her entire body went cold. She knew that face. She knew the thin scar that split the right eyebrow, the surgical flatness behind the eyes, the jaw that had been rebuilt after a contract in Marseille 3 winters ago. She had stared at that face for 6 weeks inside a sealed gray folder she was never supposed to open, a face attached to an offshore wire transfer she had flagged and been ordered to forget. Victor Sable, the surgeon. A man who, in the entire history of his trade, had never once carried a tray of shrimp toast. The breath left her lungs. The room kept laughing, oblivious, gilded, drunk on its own importance. Sable was 11 feet from Lucian's spine and closing, and the 2 bodyguards flanking the Iron King were turned outward toward the famous faces, watching for threats that wore tuxedos, never imagining death would come dressed as the help. Mara did not decide to move. Something older than thought moved her, dropped the tablet, sent it cracking against the marble, and as 400 heads turned at the noise, she was already running, graceless and gasping, her body doing the one thing it had been mocked for her entire life, being big, being loud, being impossible to ignore. And she hit Lucian Varga full in the side with the whole soft weight of herself an instant before the suppressed round, meant for the base of his skull, tore instead through the empty air and buried itself in a marble column. The flash, the flat, ugly cough of the shot, the screams, glass everywhere, and the Iron King of Calder going down hard beneath the body of his harmless assistant, alive, breathing, blinking up in pure animal shock at the woman who had just become the only person in a decade to put her hands on him, without permission, and the only person ever to save his life. Hold that picture for a moment, because it is the whole story in a single frame. The devil of Calder flat on his back in shattered crystal, and above him, breathing hard, terrified, magnificent, the woman the entire room had spent the evening failing to see. They had all been so certain they knew where the danger in that ballroom lived. They had watched the men in tuxedos and the men at the doors. Not one of them had looked twice at the chubby assistant by the service entrance, and that, in the end, was the most expensive mistake any of them would ever make. To understand how Mara Quinn ended up shielding the devil with her own body, you have to go back, because 3 months earlier, she had been nothing to him at all, and he had been nothing to her but the reason her hands shook when she signed her own name. 3 months before the night at the Aurelian, Mara Quinn had been a forensic accountant in the financial crimes unit of a mid-tier compliance firm. The kind of woman who was brilliant in a windowless room and forgettable everywhere else. The one who found the seam in a ledger that 19 senior analysts had walked past. The one whose name never made it into the press release. She had an eidetic memory, a gift and a curse, a mind that filed every face it had ever seen and every number it had ever read in clean index drawers that never lost a thing. She remembered the precise tilt of a stranger's mouth on a subway platform years ago. She remembered routing numbers the way other people remembered song lyrics. She could glance at a column of figures for a heartbeat and feel the one that was lying. And she remembered most of all the day the firm folded under a regulatory raid, and she discovered the seam she had pulled on led straight into the laundered architecture of the Varga organization, the most powerful, most insulated criminal empire on the eastern seaboard, run by a man the newspapers only ever called the Iron King because his real name made editors nervous. She should have run. Instead, a black Maybach had pulled up outside her apartment in the Key District at 6 a.m, and a stoic mountain of a man named Dmitri had told her, with terrible politeness, that Mr. Varga did not kill people who were useful, and that she had a choice between being useful and being a problem. So she took the job. Personal assistant, the offer said, though everyone in the building understood she was the woman who would quietly clean the numbers, build the threat files, and keep her enormous, dangerous mouth shut. The first time she saw Lucien Varga in person, she forgot how to breathe, and not for the romantic reasons the magazines would later invent, but because the cold coming off him was real. A winter you could feel across a marble lobby. The stillness of a man who had buried so many people that mercy had simply gone extinct in him. He did not look at her. Men like that never looked at women like her. And Mara had made her peace with that fiction so long ago that she barely felt the old ache anymore. The years of being the funny friend, the smart one, the before photo, the girl whose worth was always a project somebody else might finish someday. Her mother had measured her dinners with her eyes. Her ex had introduced her every single time as a girl with such a pretty face, the cruelty wrapped in a compliment so the wound would not show. She kept her head down. She wore beige and gray and apologized for her hips in elevators. She ate her sad desk salad alone in a supply closet so that nobody could watch her eat and decide, the way everyone always had, that a body her size had forfeited the right to enjoy a single thing. What she did not know, what nobody knew, was that the Iron King had begun to watch her the way a man watches a fire he cannot explain, that he had read every memo she wrote twice, that he had noticed the $7 million discrepancy she found in the doc contracts before his own consigliere did, and that the most dangerous man in Calder had started lingering, just slightly, just unforgivably, near the doorway of the small office where the chubby assistant thought she was invisible, learning the sound of her pen, the way she hummed when the numbers finally confessed. He had watched her once stay until 3 a.m. to chase a rounding error that nobody else would ever have caught. And he had stood in the dark hallway and felt something he had not felt since he was a boy. The strange ache of admiring a person for who they were rather than what they could do for him. And it had frightened him more than any man with a gun ever had. He learned her coffee order without asking. He moved the meeting with the dock bosses so it would not run past the hour she usually left. He told himself it was nothing, that the most ruthless man in Calder did not develop a weakness for a soft-spoken accountant who blushed when he passed her in the corridor. And he was wrong, and the wrongness of it would one day be the only reason he was alive. The danger did not arrive all at once. It seeped in the way water finds a crack, patient and silent, long before the flood. It started with the numbers, because it always started with the numbers for Mara, the way other people sensed a storm in their knees. She had been given the organization's clean books to maintain, the laundered legitimate face of the empire, the foundations and the shipping concerns and the real estate trusts. And somewhere in the third week, she had felt the wrongness before she could name it, a faint asymmetry in the way money moved through the Adriatic Holdings account. Sums that left on a Tuesday and came back smaller on a Friday, shaved by a hand so smooth that the loss looked like ordinary friction. She traced it for 9 nights, alone in the small office after the building emptied, takeout going cold beside the keyboard, her reflection ghosting in the black window above the sleeping city. She built a model. She reconstructed 18 months of transfers from memory when the originals had been conveniently purged, because her memory could not be purged. And that, she would realize far too late, was exactly what made her dangerous to the wrong person. The model pointed, with the cold indifference of arithmetic, at a name she did not want it to point at: Adrian Holt, the silver-haired financial advisor who had run the Varga money for 20 years. The man with the warm laugh and the diamond cufflinks and the habit of calling her sweetheart while looking through her like glass. Holt was siphoning, slowly, beautifully, and worse than the theft was the pattern beneath it, because some of the money was flowing outward to shell companies that fed, 3 hops downstream, into accounts she recognized from her old life, accounts tied to the Virnov syndicate, the rival faction that had been bleeding the Varga territories for a year. Adrian Holt was not just a thief. Adrian Holt was a door someone had left open. She took it to him first, the proper way, the foolish way, because she still believed in the proper way. And he had smiled at her over his reading glasses and told her she had a wonderful imagination for a girl in her position, that the numbers were complicated, that she should focus on her seating charts and leave the architecture to the men who understood it. And he had patted her hand and asked gently, almost lovingly, whether she really wanted to make accusations she could not survive. She had walked out shaking. For 3 nights after that, she had jumped at every sound, double-locked her door, watched the black cars on her street a beat too long, because she understood exactly what she had become the instant she opened her mouth, a loose thread in a tapestry that men killed to keep whole. She thought about running, about emptying her accounts and vanishing into a city where nobody knew the Varga name. But she had nowhere to run that the Iron King could not reach, and some stubborn ember in her, the same ember that had pulled the seam in the first place, refused to let a man like Holt win simply because she was afraid. So she did the only thing she knew how to do. She kept building the case, quietly, obsessively, copying everything into a place no smooth hand could reach, her own unpurgeable memory. She had drafted a memo to Lucian directly, 3 careful paragraphs, every figure cited, and she had watched it vanish into the silence of a man who did not answer assistance, never knowing it had been intercepted before it reached him, deleted by the same smooth hand. And so the warning sat unread, the seam unpulled, while the Varga Foundation gala at the Aurelian drew closer on the calendar, 400 guests, a charity auction. The Iron King exposed on a marble floor for one carefully publicized evening, and Adrian Holt, smiling, helpful, indispensable Adrian Holt, personally revised the security rotation and personally approved the catering staff, swapping one name on the service roster for another. A quiet white jacket, a tray held a fraction too high, a scar splitting a right eyebrow, a man who had never carried shrimp toast in his life. The gala itself was meant to be a coronation, the Iron King in his full cold glory, and for 90 minutes it was exactly that. Mara had been brought along to manage the floor, to whisper the names of arrivals into a headset, to make sure the mayor and the developer who hated the mayor were seated 40 feet apart, and she had done it flawlessly from the shadows by the service doors, a soft gray moon orbiting a black sun. She had let herself look at him only twice. The first time, he was laughing at something a senator said, except his eyes were not laughing. His eyes were doing what they always did, counting exits, weighing throats. And the second time he was looking back at her, directly, unmistakably, for a full second that turned her stomach to warm water before she dropped her gaze and scolded herself for being a child. Then the world narrowed to a white jacket. She had clocked Sable at the same instant her memory threw the gray folder open, and everything after happened in a corridor of slowed time. The tray too high, the left hand at the hip, the bodyguards facing the wrong way, the 11 feet shrinking to 9, to 7. She knew his record. She knew the folder said 40 confirmed. that he favored close work in crowds, that he had walked out of a sealed embassy once and a hospital twice, and she felt the old paralysis rise. The lifelong instinct to shrink, to be quiet, to assume she must be wrong, because girls like her were always wrong. The voice of her mother and her ex, and every room that had ever made her apologize for existing, all saying the same thing. Sit down, be small, you are imagining it. Who do you think you are? She crushed it under the only thing louder, which was the certainty of arithmetic, because Mara Quinn was never wrong about a face. She dropped the tablet on purpose, a gunshot of plastic on marble, 400 heads turning, and in the half-second of confusion, she was already moving, throwing every pound of her mocked and apologized for body into a dead run. And Victor Sable, the best in his trade, made the only mistake of his career. He flinched at the noise and adjusted, half a degree, a hairline correction, and that half degree and the soft mass of a running woman were the difference between the Iron King's brains on the marble and the Iron King's body driven sideways under hers as the suppressed round split the air where his skull had been and shattered into the column. They went down together in a tangle of silk and breath. The screams came late, the way screams always do. Dmitri was on Sable in under 2 seconds, 2 more guards behind him, and the assassin who had killed 40 men vanished beneath a pile of black suits. But Mara did not see any of it, because she was lying half across the most dangerous man alive, her hands fisted in his lapels, her cheek against his jaw, both of them breathing hard, and Lucian Varga was staring up at her with an expression no living person had ever seen on his face, raw, cracked open, undone, the look of a man who has just discovered there is something in the world he was not prepared to lose. And the first thing the Iron King of Calder said to the woman, everyone called Harmless, in a voice gone low and strange, was a single word, her name, as if he were learning it for the first time. Mara. What happened next Mara would remember for the rest of her life as the moment the temperature of the world changed, because the Iron King did not get up and brush off his suit and resume being marble. He came up off that floor with her clutched against his chest, one arm banded around her back like a steel cable, and the cold that everyone in Calder feared turned out to have a furnace under it after all. He did not shout. The truly dangerous never shout. He stood in the wreckage of his own gala, with 400 terrified guests pressed to the walls and Victor Sable pinned and bleeding under his men. And Lucian Varga said, in a voice quiet enough that the whole silenced ballroom had to lean in to hear it, lock the city. 2 words. Dmitri repeated them into a phone, and within 20 minutes the bridges out of Calder were choked, the private terminals at the airfield grounded, the harbor masters paid off and the docks sealed, every tunnel mouth watched, an entire metropolis quietly clamped shut around one wounded answer, because the man who never lost control had, for the first and only time, something to avenge. He carried Mara himself through the service corridors to a waiting car, would not let Dmitri take her, would not let anyone's hands on her but his own, his jaw set, his eyes scanning every shadow as if the building itself might try again. And when she tried to apologize, the reflex of a lifetime, I'm sorry. I dropped your tablet. I tackled you in front of everyone. I ruined your evening. He stopped walking and looked at her with those terrible thawing eyes and said, the thing that broke the old story she had carried about herself since she was a girl. Do not ever apologize to me again for the body that just saved my life. In the back of the Maybach, he held her shaking hands in his and asked her, very softly, how she had known, and she told him. The face, the wire transfer, the gray folder, 6 weeks of staring, the way she never forgot a face, the memo no one had read, and she watched the math assemble itself behind his eyes. The realization that the woman he had filed away as a useful nobody had carried the one piece of knowledge that kept his heart beating, and that someone inside his own house had buried her warning and aimed a surgeon at his skull. He brought her to the safe house in the Heights, a fortress of glass and stone above the lights of the city he had just caged, and he sat her down and had his private doctor look her over for shock, for the bruise blooming purple along her shoulder where she had hit him, and he hovered the entire time like a man unaccustomed to fear and hating the taste of it. And when the old physician was gone, Lucian crouched in front of her chair, so that for once he was looking up at her, and he said, "The men who turned away tonight will answer for it, and the man who sent the surgeon will answer for it. But first, I need you to understand something." And Mara, braced for the hardness she had always been braced for, heard instead the most dangerous man alive say, "I have looked through people my entire life. I have never once been able to look through you. You have been the loudest thing in every room I have ever shared with you, and I have spent 3 months pretending I could not hear it." Any other woman might have melted into the moment, but Mara Quinn was not built to be saved. She was built to solve, and somewhere in the long electric night in the glass house above Calder, while Lucian's soldiers swept the city and Victor Sable refused to talk in a basement she would never ask about, she did the thing that turned a rescue into a reckoning. She asked for her laptop. She asked for the Adriatic holding statements and the gala's revised security roster and the catering vendor's payment records, and she sat cross-legged on the floor of a billionaire's safe house in her ruined borrowed dress, hair falling out of its pins, mascara smudged into war paint, and she went hunting through the numbers the way she had been born to, and Lucian Varga, the Iron King, sat on the arm of a chair and watched her work with an expression close to reverence, because he had commanded armies of clever men, and not one of them moved through a ledger the way this woman did, like a shark through warm water. It took her 90 minutes. The roster swap that placed Sable on the floor traced to a single approval signature, scrubbed and laundered through 3 internal systems, but the timestamps had a tell. A tiny temporal fingerprint left when someone backdates a record in a hurry, and she walked it back through the same friction pattern she had flagged weeks before. The smooth shaving hand, the Adriatic outflows, the shell hops into Virnoff accounts, until every separate thread she had pulled in 3 months drew tight into a single throat: Adrian Holt. The thief was the door, and the door had let the surgeon in, sold his king to the rival syndicate for a number with too many zeros and a promise to keep his stolen empire when the dust settled. She turned the laptop around so Lucian could see it, the whole architecture of the betrayal laid out in her clean indexed hand, every transfer, every timestamp, every lie, and she watched the last warmth drain out of his face and the marble come back, but this time the cold was for someone else. He made one call. What followed was the thing Calder would whisper about for years without ever quite believing: the night the Iron King went to war over a woman. Dmitri moved first, and behind him moved the whole machine, and the city that had laughed in a ballroom learned what the cold could do when it finally turned warm. 3 Virnoff safe houses burned before sunrise, not with fire, but with the quiet, efficient violence of men who had been waiting a long time for permission. A money office in the Heights was breached at 2 in the morning, doors coming off their hinges, every laptop and ledger carried out into the dark. Lucian himself did not sleep. He stood at the glass wall of the safe house with Mara wrapped in his coat behind him and watched the lights of his city go out, block by block, as his people closed every road the betrayal might have used to escape. And somewhere in those long hours, Victor Sable, the surgeon who never spoke, finally gave up one name in exchange for a death that would be merciful, and the name he gave matched, to the letter, the name already glowing on the screen of Mara Quinn's laptop. By dawn, Adrian Holt had been brought to the glass house in the Heights, silver hair mussed, cufflinks still glinting, sputtering about loyalty and decades and how dare you, and he stopped sputtering when he saw Mara standing beside the Iron King. No longer beige, no longer folded, wearing one of Lucian's black coats over her dress like dark armor. Holt's face curdled into the old contempt, and he made the final mistake of underestimating her one last time, sneering, "You'd take the word of this fat little calculator over 20 years of," and he never finished, because Lucian Varga crossed the room, and the temperature in it dropped to absolute 0, and Mara stepped forward first, before Lucian's hands could close, and said, in a voice she had never used in her life, calm and total and free, "I am the word of God in this house now, Adrian, and the numbers do not lie the way you do." And the Iron King looked at the woman he loved, and then at the man who had tried to have him killed, and said only quietly, "Take him." And the door closed. And Adrian Holt was never again a problem anyone in Calder had to solve. In the weeks that followed, Calder reset itself the way it always did. The bridges opened, the docks breathed, the surgeon and the door both quietly ceased to exist. And Mara Quinn discovered what it was to be claimed by a man who had decided she was the only treasure worth keeping in a life built on stealing. He did not change her. That was the thing she had never believed possible. The fear coded into her since girlhood that love, if it ever came, would arrive with a renovation plan attached, a list of conditions, a someday when you. Lucian Varga did not put her on a diet of his approval. He took her to a salon on the quay, run by an old woman who designed for queens and royalty in exile, and he stood with his arms folded while they built a gown around her exactly as she was, deep wine silk that poured over her hips like it had been waiting its whole existence to find them, a neckline that did not apologize for a single inch of her. And when Mara saw herself in the three-way mirror, she did the thing she had not done since she was a small girl. She stood up straight and took up all of her space and did not flinch. And behind her in the glass, the most feared man in the city watched her see herself and murmured, "There she is, my queen," the loudest thing in every room. And for the first time in her life, Mara did not argue with the mirror, did not subtract herself, did not run the cruel arithmetic of every pound and every flaw, because the cruelest accountant she had ever known had always been the one inside her own head, and she had finally fired her. She saw what he saw. Not a project, not a before photo, not a pretty face attached to an apology, but a woman who had run toward a bullet, a mind that had unmade an empire's traitor in 90 minutes, a body that had taken the impact meant to end a king and had not broken. Power, where she had only ever been taught to see shame. He fed her in front of people, on purpose, at the best table at Lazar's with the whole city watching, pulled her chair out and ordered everything on the menu and watched her eat with unapologetic joy. And he held her gaze the entire time as if daring the room to have an opinion, because he had learned the exact shape of the wound and he was going to fill every inch of it with his own hands. He called her Regina. He called her treasure. He told her she was exactly what he needed to hold, soft enough to be real and sharp enough to be deadly, the only person who had ever stood between him and an ending. And the night he finally gave her his name, the real one, the one editors were afraid to print, he did it with her face in his hands and a vow that the Iron King of Calder belonged, completely and forever, to the woman everyone had called Harmless, and that anyone who ever made her feel small again would learn what a locked city felt like from the inside. And isn't that the part that gives you chills? The moment the Harmless one turns out to be the most powerful person in the room. The chubby assistant who carried the whole empire's survival in a memory nobody bothered to ask about. The girl they all looked through, becoming the one thing the devil could not live without. If your heart pounded when she dropped that tablet and ran, if you felt that fierce little thrill when she told Adrian the numbers do not lie the way you do, then do me a favor and smash that like button right now. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that being underestimated is a weapon and not a wound, and subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss what comes next, because the next story is even darker and even sweeter. And drop a comment and tell me, would you have run toward the danger the way Mara did? Would you have been brave enough and stay close? Because the Queen of Calder is only getting started.